Matthew, I think we are live. Hi, world. I'm Sam Lickenstein, one of your directors of analysis. I'm here with my esteemed colleague, Matthew Bay, who's our lead global analyst, who's really been taking the lead on looking into the topic that we're going to be discussing today. Matthew, do you want to give us a little intro here?
Yeah, hey, Matthew, thanks for having me. Yeah, so today we're talking about using ChatGPT as a way, and also I guess chatbots in general as a way to help improve analysis. I know that Sam and we both dabbled on it. Me quite a bit. I'm not sure exactly how much Sam, in terms of testing various use cases, all those kinds of things.
Yeah, I mean, I will tell you, Matthew, that we had, I think, a third interview with an applicant who asked me if we were going to be replacing analysts with ChatGPT. So this is clearly on the mind of people, knowing that ChatGPT could be used as a tool.
My,
For the record, we are not doing that. We very much like our human analysts. But why don't you kind of walk us through with some of the things that you've been trying out?
yeah, so one of the things that I think is very promising is using it for various various things where you need to do a lot of brainstorming, or you need to bring in a lot of different types of information, because as an analyst I have a background in mathematics and science. I don't have a background in extreme politics in Russia. I don't follow Russia that closely. So having that ability to bring in other backgrounds can be hard for an analyst that's sometimes working siloed and things like that. So one of the use case studies that we've been working on is around how it can help an analyst quickly do things like scenario planning, and whether or not it can help, bring and bridge that gap. Ideally, of course, scenario planning involves analysts of all kinds of backgrounds, because they're all going to have a different perspective, especially on a very broad question. But this can maybe help in a time crunch or in a short term, or even if you have a limited staff, be able to still come up with a more robust scenario planning exercise than you might do by yourself or something like that.
Yeah, and obviously one of the things you work on, Matthew, a lot is our key forecast questions, or this is the exact type of work that we do where we'll put together a basic question, try to think about the ways that it will develop over time, considering the forces that would interact on it, the indicators that we would want to know if it's coming true or not. And so this seems like it would be a big help in at least kind of getting a lay of the land, so to speak.
Yeah, and as I've tested going through this for scenario planning, I've found that if you just kind of do a hands-off approach, i.e., you walk through, one of the different intelligence communities, different kind of structured ways of doing scenario planning. You walk through, say, the cone of plausibility method, things like that, and you only do it all like a hands-off, where you just say, act as a facilitator to say, hey, do this, build forces, build assumptions, create these scenarios. It's going to give you some weird things. So, for example, one of the things that I tested earlier this week was, where is the state of the United States politically in 10 years? And that is clearly, we're thinking about the US political system. But one of the top forces that it gave me for that was US climate policy. And that actually, it said that was the most important one. I'm like, I know as an analyst, it's like, okay, I know that's a thing, but I don't think that's the most important thing for this question. So there's still a lot has to be kind of a thing where the analysts have to take an active role. These technologies are not at a space right now where we can just let them create the scenarios by themselves and things like that. But one thing that I will say is that a lot of people have criticism for ChatGPT for like very technical things or very things like this, because it's like, well, it makes up stuff, right? It doesn't always have accurate information. It's kind of, it's built on the idea of, predicting the next, few word or letters in a sentence, things like that. But for things that require brainstorming, you can almost think of that as a feature, not a bug, in the sense of, you're going to get something unique, or something that's, sometimes outside of the box. Can sometimes, that helps with things like blindside analysis, where you're not really thinking of all of these things. So sometimes having it come out with the idea of maybe climate change is something we have to consider as being a major force, and where the US goes politically. Or if you're even doing things like brainstorming your list of assumptions, or you're brainstorming your list of forces or drivers, you may find out that you haven't considered something that it did consider. And it allows you at least to have that instantaneously, that feedback of just realizing, oh, maybe there is something I'm missing because it said so. And if the answer as an analyst is, you can still say is, it said that, but I disagree. But it's still, having that kind of, idea, it's still added, no questions or stupid questions. It kind of does help in that regard when it comes to the brainstorming type aspects of our job.
Yeah, I mean, at a minimum, it helps you rule out all of the potential things out there to really have even more confidence potentially in your assessment. But it kind of speaks to, I think, what you were getting at in your intro, which is like, it's a great tool to supplement, but you obviously still need the human in the loop, so to speak.
Yeah, I'm
I
really
mean,
wondering how many of your applicants also use ChatGPT to write the cover letter,
yeah,
right?
I really hope not. Because I mean, some
um,
of the things that I've been testing with, like I was asking it a number of times to play out how different conflicts hypothetically develop. You know, what would cause China to invade Taiwan or X or Y, et cetera. And what I noticed is a lot of the outputs were basically kind of the same three or four scenarios, no matter what part of the world you looked at. So what you would need to do is then follow up with more nuanced questions. And so it was again an example where like, okay, this can help me with kind of get the lay of the land. But to really get something useful, I needed to have a little more content knowledge to dig down a little deeper to kind of press the tool to not just give the same response to basically any conflict.
Yeah, and it's really actually is good when you tell it to go in a direction. So, for example, in that one that I was talking about, I had it create like 5 or 6 scenarios. They were all relatively what I would say optimistic scenarios or good for the U.S. scenarios. It really didn't do bad scenarios, which is kind of its liberal bias, I guess, is what the argument is around there. But I was basically like, okay, now create 2 bad scenarios, and it did. So it's like if you push it in that direction, it can help with that. Another thing, though, that I think it is somewhat useful when it comes to scenario planning and or just general analysis is that because we don't have backgrounds in anything, it may be able to, if you just put in text or you ask questions about a specific subject matter, that it has access to everything that it was trained on. So it has all kinds of different backgrounds where it can just dive into a wealth of knowledge. Sure, some of it may be inaccurate what it gives you, but it at least can say is like, hey, I may not be an expert in Russian politics, but I may ask is like, okay, find cases where this assumption that I have about Russia is false, or something about any other subject matter, and it will spit out 5 or 6 things. Honestly, I know that those are not necessarily always going to be accurate, but then if I need to, I can go through those 6 things, confirm it through Google, confirm it through speaking with our Eurasia team, things like that, that then allow me to at least um, go in that direction in a way that I wouldn't be able to by myself without having just, I have no starting point because I don't have an expertise in that area.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, you're reminding me of that case that's been getting a lot of press about the lawyer who used ChatGPT that basically made up. My wife Julia is like obsessed with this, so I feel like I have to mention this on here. But it's again that example of why you need that human there to take the information, not necessarily at face value, but as an indicator of what could be out there, and then follow up with your own research or other source of confirmation.
Yeah, another area where we're looking at it is, from an analytical standpoint, is what it can be used for things like adversarial analysis and things like that. Because one thing you can have it do, and it can probably do a decent job at this, is act or behave like a certain actor that it either has knowledge of or you give it specific parameters of. I know there are other, of course, tools that allow for a similar type of analysis, of course, but it can do that in a way of like, how would, President Trump react in this scenario? And it could draw upon, things that he had done previously in order to say, like, what if we have, for example, Sam, one of the things that we've been discussing, I know in our analytical meetings over the last couple of days is a potential US Iran deal that was either may or may not happen. That's an interim one is like, we could ask it things like, well, how would President Trump respond if he's elected and this happens? Things like that, which, it's not necessarily going to be, unique because we could always have a Eurasia analyst try to think through that, but we can also then do it as a type of a red team on like, well, do the two of them agree or not? So there's all kinds of red teaming, war gaming, all that kind of stuff. Strategies I think is also an area of um, of potential uses. And again, that's again masking the idea of the accuracy isn't really all that important in that kind of a use case.
Yeah, and that reminds me of something you said at the very beginning, which is particularly for like smaller teams that don't necessarily have the people, the expertise to cover all these topics. It's a great way to at least proverbially kind of get the conversation started. I mean, again, you can't just take it at face value. Well, this is what for new President Trump would do, but you could at least consider, okay, here's a constellation of options. Let me think about which one of these are more plausible.
And even for like an analyst who has other people on their team that are experts in that area, sometimes what I've found is that sometimes I don't even know the right questions to ask them. I can at least get that head start and saying, okay, ChatGPT spit this out. Okay, I kind of see what they're going at. Hey, Sam, on this area, do you agree with that? Does this make sense to you? And you might be like, hey, yeah, it's great. Or you're like, well, no, actually, this doesn't make any sense. But at least it helps have that conversation without starting at a zero level. So that's another thing. And then the last one that I kind of wanted to bring up is the use of trying to accelerate. And I know this is a very long process, and typically the ACH analysis, so alternative competing hypotheses. It's really good at taking random disparate pieces of information and then trying to put them in a table and trying things like that to order to do things. But again, I think what that case is about, it's about accelerating the time that an analyst can do. So again, all these different use cases that we're talking about, they are all about taking an analyst and maximizing its potential, expanding the way that it's using this resources, increasing its productivity. It's not about replacing the analyst.
Yeah, and for those of you who aren't familiar with ACH analysis, it can take, I mean, hours, if not days, depending on like how intense you want to go. But it's basically about looking at different hypotheses for a question and trying to find evidence that either confirms or disconfirms, so to speak, which is a great analytic tool and can lead to really robust analysis. But to Matthew, like you're saying, if you're able to kind of speed up that process a little bit, it could make it a lot more accessible. And that would, of course, increase the rigor of your assessment that you're making.
And one thing that it can do, and again, this is how relevant this can be is going to vary from question to question, is you can have it generate each of the evidence points that you may have throughout history or something that to confirm it. You always need to go, of course, back and check them out, make sure they're accurate, things like that. But anything that gives you a heads up to at least start that process is going to be a time saver. But that does get us to our, the last constraint. I think the big one that is in our field is that right now, at least when we talk about ChatGPT, its information is largely only trained up to August of 2021. You can feed in links, you can feed in information, you can do all this to try to update that. So some of the things that I've said is like, okay, this is what happened in the United States the last few years. We had the 2022 midterms. This is what happened, et cetera. And it was able to give me a more robust answer with that new knowledge. But one of the things that I've found is that, at least this is probably a limitation just for now. It's probably one of the things that will, as these evolve, not be as big of an issue. Is that as you have longer conversations, it gets more and more off the rails, which means if you're being forced to have 16, 20, 30 messages, inputs, et cetera, it's going to get you further away from your original thing. So what happened to me, for example, on that use case I was testing this week, is I generated 4 or 5 scenarios, and then after maybe 10 messages going back and forth, I asked them to summarize the scenarios, put them in a table or whatever. It gave me different scenarios. I'm like, that's not what you gave me. So it's like there is this issue of like, okay, if you're being forced to work together with it to try to push it in the right direction, is how long can you do that, but then have the same internal consistency of whatever you're doing in a scenario planning exercise or ACH or whatever use case it is.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely done the kind of imagine if and then given it a prompt. And to your point, maybe if you go 1 or 2, maybe 3 of those prompts, it sticks with you. But if you go to a situation where you're asking 5 or 6 follow-up questions, it definitely decreases its ability to give you a realistic output.
And that's actually a good point, because I think that, because I don't usually have that problem in the 3 or 4, but you may be using ChatGPT 3.5, so that's the unpaid one. They now have a paid one, ChatGPT 4. But my point being, though, is that those have different number of tokens that they use, which
Yeah.
means that the one that I'm using is more able to go to longer conversations. So I think this is more of a thing right now. But as these expand, as there are more tokens that are used in these systems, you will be able to go longer conversations that are able to stay somewhat sane, I guess, or you'll be able to reference its same stuff repeatedly over the course of 100 messages, not 10 or 5 or whatever it may be.
Yeah, I mean, undoubtedly, we're going to have a lot more conversations about this and all these other AI tools that, of course, are the hot topics of conversation. They just impact our work so much.
They will honestly probably revolutionize the way that we do our jobs, and they already are starting to we can see that already, to be honest.
I mean, that's a perfect place to end up right there.
Yeah.
All right. Have a great weekend, everybody.